All right, we have finished our testing for the day, and it is time to move on to our next chapter. Now, next week we'll be testing chapter 10. So, online students, we've got roughly 2 more chapters we're going to do after this week, and then we're going to finish out testing on those, and then we're going to have review, and then on the 18th of December is finals. So those that are online need to be caught up, that are taking the class for credit, need to be caught up with their tests by then, or at least be very near it. But chapter 10 is what we're going over today. Towns and villages. We're in the second part of the book now. Page 170. Chapter 11. Yeah, not chapter 10. We went over chapter 10 last week, made it through somehow, miraculously. That was a long chapter. But chapter 11 is what we're going over today. My bad. And then next week, 12, and then the week after 13. And then we'll finish out testing those the following weeks. And then reviewing for finals, and then the day of finals on the 18th. All right, chapter 11, Towns and Villages, page 170. When people moved away from caves and began to cultivate the land, they settled in places where the land was fertile and where there was a ready supply of water. Okay, remember we learned that when settlement began, it was because there had been advancements in agriculture. They learned how to farm. They learned that hey, we can collect these seeds and plant them somewhere and they'll grow and we can gather them closer to home. So that made settlement possible. This sometimes led to conflict with nomadic groups who wanted to share the water. This conflict made it necessary for the new farmers to live near one another for mutual protection, and it was for this reason that the village came into being. If the village was vulnerable, it would sometimes be built so that the blank walls of the houses formed a defensive village wall, with access only through one gap or gate. If the village was on an easily defended site, and if it was on a trade route, then at the time when the invention of the bronze plowshare made it possible. Okay, some of these sentences just run on. It's hard to keep the flow going. If the village was on an easily defended site, and if it was on a trade route, then at the time when the invention of the bronze plowshare made it possible to cultivate the land more intensively and so brought more wealth, the village was ringed with a defensive rampart. It was this, rather than sheer size, that turned the village into a town. So what constituted the difference between a village and a town? It was that defensive rampart that was on the roofs of the houses. So what he's basically talking about here, I wonder if there's an example on one of these pages. I might have to doodle an example on the board. Alright, so basically, what they're talking about is when the villages would be built to add some protection, they'd be built right up against one another, side by side. And then on the back side, the blank wall, where there'd be no windows or nothing, that would officially be like, or essentially be like the wall. Okay, it'd be the outside. Let's say all these rooms lined up. Okay, all the doors are on the inside, the houses are on the inside, and nobody can get in through the walls. And then what made it become a town was when they added ramparts around the top of the buildings on the outside. So it essentially kind of looked like a wall, but it was just the back sides of the buildings. So Leviticus 25, 29 through 31, but houses and villages without walls around them are to be considered as open country. Okay. Even cities as important as Jerusalem and Megiddo were only about 13 acres in extent in Old Testament times. If the rampart was replaced by a wall of solid construction, it became known as a fortified city. There was a two-way link between towns and villages. In times of warfare, the villagers would flock to the town for the protection of its walls. In the summertime, people from the town and city were glad to leave for the country where they would get involved in the harvest and so have a working holiday. Sounds like an oxymoron. Okay. Towns and villages were therefore clustered together. Okay, so let's see. I might do some doodling that. So we start off by talking about there were the nomads. Okay, then people start learning how to farm and agriculture advances. So you had, of course, you had your shepherds. They all dwelt in tents. All right, they could pick it up and go whenever they wanted. And then when you see agriculture advance, people start building houses. These are what we know as the villages. Okay, now this next one's going to be kind of hard to. They probably weren't that big, but that's supposed to be a door. And then what they started doing was building them closer together. Let's see what's the best way to do this. Let me try and do a 3D shape here. Oh, this could go very well. No, that's already looked awkward. Okay. We'll just do a front view. Alright. So, just like an encampment, right? Then you have a village, no walls, no real defensive parameters, nothing like that. So then you'd have your town. Okay, so you got a bunch of houses here. So you got 3 houses here. Okay, this is the back side of the houses. All right, so it's on the inside. Now we might try and do 3D here. This is kind of awkward here. Something more like that. I'm no artist like Brother BJ. We'll just do something so I can just say I got it done. Okay, so they would build their houses, in a shape that would allow them to have kind of a makeshift wall, if you will. So the insides, thank you. So we'll add some little windows here. Not saying they had frame glass windows, but that's what's the word that's used in the book. I can't remember now, but or lattices, I think is the word in the book, where they'd add kind of stuff into the windows like that. So you'd have the inside, all right, you'd be protected by that back side of the buildings that would kind of form a wall, but you might have like a whole, square of buildings that would essentially make a town, and then it became, what does it say there? A fortified city. Hang on. Okay, I was wrong here. So the villages, okay, and then they would kind of get something going like this, and then they have ramparts on the, So these are like kind of like defensive positions on the roof. Like when you see a castle that's built and the top of it is kind of like shaped like that. You know what I'm talking about? Like on a castle, and then you have like your archers, your people up here shooting. It'd be like defensive positions, and that's kind of the same thing that's here. They wouldn't have probably had stone until later on, but at least they could kind of get up there and chunk rocks. I guess I imagine they had bow and arrow back then. But anyway, and then what constituted a fortified city was what? When not only did they have a rampart, but they had their city surrounded. Let's see, it was on a little hill. They got their little city up there with a bunch of buildings. And then they had a wall with a gate on it. So villages, towns, okay, then you've got your villages, your town, and then your fortified city that had a wall. A wall of solid construction. It became known as a fortified city. All right. Our class is over. Back to the book. All right, the center of the village. The center of the village was the water supply. People went to the well to get their water, taking their own leather buckets and pitchers. That John 4:11 is the woman at the well. And as they did so, they met others from the village for conversation and relaxation at the beginning and end of the day. The well was not always a deep hole with a wellhead. The well was quite often in a dried up riverbed, about 4 feet square and 4 feet deep. It was filled up with water and was known as a pit, literal meaning of Jeremiah 14:3. We'll look at that. Jeremiah 14 verse 3, because the ground is chapped, for there was no rain in the earth, the plowmen were ashamed, they covered their heads. Okay. So the word head there for wellhead, I guess, is talking about the pit. Winter rains always filled the dry bed. When there were quarrels, the pits were sometimes filled in. Man, you talk about making somebody mad, go fill in their well with dirt. I mean, that's taking quarrels pretty seriously. Yeah. That's quickly turns into survival. So we have some, I really like these old 19th century photographs that they have here. The center of the village was the well where people went to get their water. A 19th century photograph of a village well in Israel. So it's kind of just probably down in there, a deep spot that's dug for water to collect.
I wonder why they would carry that on their heads. Is it easiest?
Some things are pretty heavy, but
yeah.
I've goofing around, but it is a pretty significant difference between carrying something in your arms and then putting it on top of your head. Now they're probably been doing it since they're little girls, got balance and all that, very well practiced with it. But it does ease the burden a little bit once you get it up there. Now I remember the first time I saw this picture, when you look at the bottom left, I thought this woman was carrying a big rock on her head.
I can see that.
Yep. But
turn around boulders.
Balancing that thing.
Yeah. With no hands. Just boom.
And then opposite page, the Galilee village of Capharcana, often identified with Cana of Galilee, where Jesus performed his first miracle, turning water into wine. Very pretty. All right, page 172, town walls. The most important feature of the town was its wall. I'd underline that. The most important feature of the town was its wall. Initially, the walls of important towns appeared to have been made of stone. The ancient walls of Jericho were 6 1/2 feet thick and had towers of 30 feet in height. And that was in 5000 BC. In the Bronze Age, when building became more extensive and agriculture more intensive, the foundation stones of the walls were made of stone, but the walls themselves were made of bricks. The walls tended to follow a particular contour, so that although the town had an irregular shape, it always had to be approached uphill. Walls varied in type. Some walls sloped from bottom to top with bases up to 26 feet in thickness. Some were casemate walls, two parallel walls with rooms built in the space between. Others were double walls filled with rubble. The walls did not always keep the invaders out. Therefore, after cities were taken and destroyed, it was necessary to rebuild on the ruins of the old, because inevitably the old one was built on the best site in the area. This happened so many times in some towns that when archaeologists dig into a site, they find successive levels like layers of a cake, corresponding to the times of such destruction and rebuilding. Such a site is called a tell, and by accurately dating each layer, the archaeologist can often write the history of the city. In practical building terms, the development of a tell meant that the lower part of the defensive wall had to be built as a retaining wall to hold in the higher level inside. The glacis, however you want to pronounce it, was therefore developed, a steep slope of beaten earth and rock up to the level of the new building line. The glacis was often prefaced by a wide ditch, which had the additional advantage of supplying more soil to make the glacis even higher. The wall was then erected on top of the glacis. I don't think any of that is going to be on a test, but it's just kind of explaining how they built up their cities, and how a lot of these areas where you see old ruins, they've probably, the elevation has probably been altered quite a bit over time. And then when they start digging, they find the older layers of these, older parts of the civilization. And that's how they tell how old some of these civilizations are. All right, this last part here. As techniques of siege warfare advanced, casemate walls had to be replaced by solid walls, normally affected by infill. Systems of salients and recesses were built into the walls, and towers provided for defense. The defenders could then shoot at those who were attacking the walls. In some cases, such as at Lachish, two separate walls were built, one inside the other, to give a double line of defenses. We cannot be sure how the walls were finished on the top. Okay. Rahab's house may have been built on the top because the spies hid on the roof, but it may have been the top dwelling in a casemate wall. There are some indications that the tops of the walls were hung with shields. So the casemate wall, that's where you had basically the wall surrounding the city. It had rooms under it at the bottom part of it. I think there's an illustration somewhere in this book about that. Maybe not. Oh, well, I thought there was. Okay. The gate, page 174. In the early days, the gate was the potential weak point in the defenses, and it therefore became a matter of particular concern. To possess the gate was to possess the city. It was therefore common practice for the Canaanites to offer a human sacrifice when setting up a gate. There seems to be a reference to this in 1 Kings 16:34, when Hiel's son Segub died when his father rebuilt Jericho. God had said that anyone who rebuilt the city would lose his son. The doors of a gate were made of wood covered with metal. Iron bars held the doors in place. As warfare became more sophisticated, such gates did not offer enough protection. One early design for providing that protection called for building overlapping walls with two gates, forming a courtyard between. Another was to build walls at right angles to the main walls, again forming a courtyard. If the outer gate was penetrated, there was still another, and in the meantime, the defenders could pour down liquids and shoot down things on the attackers in the courtyard below. Both forms of gate made it possible for the defenders to sally forth in sudden sorties against the enemy. The gates were heavily defended and were provided with towers to serve as lookout posts. David, in 2 Samuel 18:24 through 26, is sitting between the two gates at Mahanaim, and the watchman in the tower above is able to see a runner coming with news of the battle with Absalom's forces. The gates became still more sophisticated when the two pairs of gates were made at 90-degree angles to each other, so that the attacking soldiers had to make a turn. The gates were arranged so that the attackers had to turn left. This exposed their right-hand side, which was not covered with the shield, to the defenders above. More complex designs of zigzag entry and of 3 gates instead of 2 were also developed. And all of this is because warfare advanced. So as armor got tougher, shields got thicker, they had to rethink how they set up their gates to give them the best. Because if you lost your gates or the enemies got within the city, especially if it was a larger force, that was pretty much the end. That when it came to defending your city, the gates, whether you had one or if you had many, they had to be built strong. But you really see as time went on, the 2 gates became kind of the more prevalent of them. 1 gate, if you could only afford 1 gate, so be it. But 2 gates or more was definitely preferred as time went on. The elaborate construction of the gate was useful in peacetime. Rooms were provided in the walls for merchants to stay, and the shade provided by the high walls made it a good place for meetings. The gate was therefore a place for public speaking, the listeners sitting on the stone benches, and for conversation. It was useful for resting, and was the place where local justice was dispensed, or should have been. Gates were always shut at night, which gives rise to the joy that in the New Jerusalem there will be no night. The gates will always be open. That is nice. So here we read about the gate. A couple things that were important to note. Back on page 175, when the first sentence is there, to possess the gate was to possess the city. That's something I'd underline. And then in the paragraph following that one, the first sentence, the gates were heavily defended and were provided with towers to serve as lookout posts. That's another thing I'd note. And then we see the gate area serve many purposes. Going from the last sentence on that page onto the next page, the gate was therefore a place for public speaking. All right, the listeners would gather there, and there would be public speaking. There was a place for conversation, and it was also a place useful for resting and where local justice was dispensed. So I have 4 things that might occur around the gate: public speaking, conversation, or just socializing. And it was also useful for resting, provided a lot of shade. And lastly, there was a place where local justice was dispensed. All right. Back on page 174, above, Tel Megiddo, a site of the ancient stronghold. Okay, that's talking about the Tel from back on page where they would do diggings, and they'd go and dig the different layers, and the corresponding layers would speak of the times of destruction, and when rebuilding happened, such a site is called a Tel. And that's what that location right there is, an archaeological site. And then to the right, remains of the broad wall in Jerusalem, dating from the time of Nehemiah. And then opposite, we have the remains of the north gate to the ancient city of Megiddo. 176, remains of the gateway of the city of Dan, northern Israel. All right, town streets. In Old Testament times, streets ran off the market. They were so narrow that it was possible only for people to walk in single file. The houses were built hard up against each other, and the street was a space left between. From the street led equally narrow alleys to gain access to areas behind. This system created a network so complex it was almost impossible for a newcomer to know so that he could find his way about. It became very easy to get lost. The streets were unpaved and were full of rubbish, mud bricks, broken pottery, and refuse, often higher than the floor level of the houses themselves. Well, they make it sound like these cities were real pigsties. The rubbish on the roads was higher than the floor level of the houses themselves. During the winter time, the whole system turned into a quagmire, and in the summer, the smells made it necessary for people to work out of the city. No wonder one of the delights of the city of New Jerusalem is that it will be paved. The narrowness and darkness of the streets, together with the odd corners, made the city's centers of violence, and dogs, wolf-like and savage, roamed the area. David could hear the dogs barking in the night in Psalm 59:6, and Jesus knew they would come for the scraps under the table. Dogs were not popular. The price of a dog could never constitute a monetary offering, and calling a person a dog was an insult.
Yeah.
The price of a dog could never constitute a monetary offering. Okay.
What does that
Where's
mean?
the money?
Monetary, I guess what they're saying is not worth anything. Let me look at that reference there. Deuteronomy 23:15.
18.
Oh yeah, 18. Deuteronomy 23:18. Okay, this portion of scripture is titled in my Bible, Varied Laws. Verse 18. Thou shalt not bring the hire of a whore or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord thy God for any vow, for even both these are abomination unto the Lord thy God. Wow. The price of a dog. Worth nothing. I wonder if cats are mentioned in the Bible.
Well, no, they were in Egypt, so they had to.
Yeah, oh yeah.
You know,
They were definitely prevalent in Egypt.
they worship.
Oh yeah, they definitely worship them. And dogs were depicted in ancient Egypt too, but more so the jackals.
Oh, jackal.
Yes. But they definitely favored cats.
I like cats.
I don't mind them. I prefer dogs, but I've got a couple little stray cats around the house that I dice up a slice of bologna every once in a while for. But one of them, there's a black and white cat. It's a female, and then there's a black tomcat. And I know they've had a couple. Are they called litters with cats too? I know they've had a couple litters, and the tomcat, he has just gotten. I know I haven't been feeding him that much. He's getting fed somewhere. I know it. So I guess I'm just a little side piece, whenever he wants a snack, right? But the mama cat, she was real skittish at first, but the tomcat, he'll come up and walk around me, but every time that he walks up to me, he hisses. And, I'm getting ready to stomp on him because I ain't about to get, scratched up by, having to go get a shot and all that. But, he never went after me, but about scared me half to death about a month ago. And, I was walking the trash out, throw it in the little dumpster, garbage bin, and all of a sudden I didn't turn my light on outside, and I was just, cause it's a quick walk right out, right back in. And all of a sudden I just see this shape just run across right in front of me, about went right between my legs. And I jumped up and I was getting ready, sure enough, to come right down on it. And I saw it was that cat, and he about met his end right there.
Uh-oh.
But let's see, we'll take a little break. All right, let's get back into it. Page 177, which got done learning that dogs were worthless. Being called a dog was definitely an insult. They weren't popular. Oh, what does the world come to? Towns, our new paragraph there, towns built by the Greeks and Romans tended, by contrast, to be well planned and with paved streets. So you can immediately tell that, there's a huge difference. They kind of just placed the buildings there, didn't really care about how close they were, and the streets became the spaces in between the buildings, and the alleys, and the same when it came off the street. But when it came to the Greeks and the Romans, their cities were well planned out, and there's a huge difference between the cities in this area, especially the ones built by the Israelites, and then the Greeks and the Romans. They had wide paved streets. You could drive chariots down, and you were lucky if you could, fit down the streets and the alleys in the cities in Israel. Squares were formed where major streets crossed one another, and there were many open squares before public buildings. Caesarea, the port Herod built to bring the Romans to Judea, had a main street with shops on either side and baths and theaters. Kind of the introduction of Roman agriculture. No, not agriculture, architecture. Houses were built in blocks of 4, and there were major buildings of administration and entertainment. Antioch, which Paul used as his base, even had, one more page over, even had lighting. The question arises as to why there was so great a contrast. Basically, it was that when the Jews began to build, they did so on the foundations of the Canaanite cities, and there were a few master builders of the type of Solomon, Omri, and Ahab. All right, back on page 177, we've got a couple of depictions here. At the top, we have a probable reconstruction of the double gate at Megiddo, constructed to maximize security for the city. So you see that that first gate there, okay, they would have to fight through that. And then once they made it through that to get into the second gate, the inner gate, they would have to make a left-hand turn, which would expose the right side where they didn't have a shield. Okay, so that's why you see all these towers and ramparts here where the defenders could be. Now, one thing I don't see in this depiction is a gate for the defenders from this area to get back inside the city. So if you were out here defending, you were fighting for your life. Because if they lost that gate or got up onto the ramparts to enemy forces, well, there was no way for you to get back into the city. But at the bottom, we have the artist's reconstruction of the city gate at Dan, and that's a reconstruction, an illustration of this. Okay, that's what that is. All right. We'll look at the market here on pages 178 and 79. Now, one thing I will comment about a lot of these illustrations like this, it's almost like a weird Waldo book, trying to look and see. Like, I've never noticed until today when I was looking at this person is definitely covering their nose, because these areas were stinky, all the animals that could be a pile of dung right there, but yeah, not always a pleasant place. The market normally led off the gate and was associated with it. It was an area where the villagers brought in their produce to sell and where traders from other parts of the country brought their wares. It was normally open every weekday, for in the absence of refrigeration, it was necessary for people to purchase food on a daily basis. There were other special market days and almost festive occasions when a caravan arrived. It was not possible to bring trucks or even camels through many gateways, and therefore the porter was engaged to carry the wares into the marketplace. Jesus used the great loads carried by the porter as a picture of the burden of legalism the lawyers put on the people of his day without lifting a finger to help. Paul may have had the same practice in view when he told us to bear one another's burdens. The marketplace was generally a busy and happy place, as there were many people about. It was therefore a place where public speaking and teaching could be done, where children played games of weddings and funerals, and where the unemployed would go and hope that someone would give them work. Houses surrounding the marketplace might provide a place to call out the news, and places where craftsmen could work and sell their wares. Somewhere in this area, the public oven would be sited. All right, and then of course the caption for this illustration, a market of Bible times. Notice the camels with their packs of merchandise, the traders with their booths, and the beggar in the foreground.
So what does it mean to carry each other's burdens?
Well, there's the very real sense of kind of like what he's talking about here, the picture, actually helping people carry stuff. And then, talking about, we'll look at the scripture reference for the Paul one there in Galatians chapter 6. That's a spiritual sense, most definitely speaking there. And where Jesus is talking too. But Galatians 6:2 is definitely kind of in reference to what I think you're asking. Yeah. Carry one another's burdens. No, well, we'll go to verse 1. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Okay. Of course, they just give verse 2 as a reference there, but verse 1 is important. Okay. If a brethren be overtaken, or if a man be overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself. Whenever we go to, when someone is at fault with us, or maybe they're at fault with another and want to see them restored, we always need to consider ourselves. Before we go trying to fix somebody else, we need to check ourselves. Okay? And that's what he says there, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. And then bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. I wish I knew the reference for that, which is probably actually what that Luke 11:46 is. But whenever we see someone struggling, especially in sin, us knowing that it's wrong, we don't want to come at them and say, hey, you're definitely in the wrong. We want to tell them that. But, we don't only want to, just point out their wrongdoings and leave it there. We want to see them, get right with the Lord, reconcile, and also not just getting right with the Lord, but getting right with the wronged or offended party, and reconciliation is always the goal. And, when you see someone in sin, you can help them by relating to them, okay? Letting them know that you're praying for them, encouraging them. And you can definitely help ease their burden, or, and another, great thing to do there is point them to Jesus. He's the bearer of all burdens. But that Luke 11:46, he's talking about the They had all these, we know the Pharisees, they had all these other laws that they had added, supplementary laws to God's law that, were just even more of a burden for them to carry. That Luke's 11:46. Woe unto you also, you lawyers, for you laid men with burdens grievous to be borne, and you yourselves touch not the burdens with one of your fingers. So they were heaping unto them all these other burdens, all these other laws, and they wouldn't even, bother to help those that were burdened by it. All right. Page 180. Central Fortress. In some towns, a central castle was built as a royal residence and as a means of last defense for the remainder of the population if the outer walls were breached. Omri seems to have done this in the city of Samaria. The Acra, or Herod's Palace, and Castle Antonia were all castles of this type in Jerusalem. A temple could also be used for defense. The Tower of Shechem seems to have been of this type. When Jerusalem fell to the Roman armies in AD 70, the final stand was made at the temple. It became the practice to build additional walls in the castle area, so constituting an upper city and a lower city. Okay. The water supply. Water provision was a necessity if a city was to withstand a siege. Some cities had easy access to water. Jericho had a spring, and the water used by Mary at Nazareth is still flowing in the city today. Other places had some difficulty in providing an adequate, secure water supply. In some cases, provision was made by digging down to the water level. This was done to begin with in Jerusalem. In Megiddo and Hazor, huge pits that went down to water level were dug inside the city. Then a tunnel was built out to the source of the water beyond the city walls. Cisterns supplied much of the domestic water needs. There is still a huge one in the use in the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem, which in the time of Jesus was in the northern suburb of the city. It still supplies all the water needed for the garden throughout the dry season, even today. The water cisterns of Bethlehem were well known for their cool water. When lime plaster was developed, the water was retained for even longer. But cisterns and pools were also provided publicly too. The pools of Gibeon have been excavated. One is rectangular, 35 by 35 feet, and another is 30 feet in diameter and 60 feet deep. There was a pool in Samaria, and there were others in Jerusalem. One of the most remarkable waterworks is the tunnel Hezekiah constructed to bring water from an underground spring through a ridge to a pool inside the city walls, the Pool of Siloam. As the standards of water engineering were improved, aqueducts and clay pipes were used to bring water from Solomon's pools near Bethlehem into Jerusalem. Similarly, 2 aqueducts were built to bring water into Caesarea. All right, back on page 180, we've got a couple blue boxes there with some good information in them. The top one, following after Jesus. Today, to follow after a person means to put oneself in a secondary position, but the phrase did not mean that in Bible times. The streets were so narrow that if 2 people went together, they had to go in single file. To follow after a person was to go with them. We would therefore say, if anyone comes with me. So I guess he's saying if anyone comes with me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me or come with me. Okay. All right, Jesus' yoke, the bottom text box. It is commonly thought that Jesus was talking in Matthew 11:28 about the yoke that harnessed animals together when they were pulling a plow or a load. He was instead referring to a piece of wood that was fitted over one's shoulders so that loads could be hung on it. The device was similar to the yoke used by the milkmaid of a bygone age when she was carrying 2 pails. The reference in Matthew 11 is to a porter. Often he was asked to carry loads impossible for a human being, but when he was given a yoke, the burden became much easier. Jesus does not say that he will take our burdens away, but that he will give us the means of carrying them so that they are not too much for us. Okay, yeah, that's good. That kind of helps us with the previous question you asked. All right. Back to page 182. The development of the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem provides a good example of the development of a city. And because it is so important in the Bible, we shall look at the development of the city throughout Bible times. Okay, it was first built by the Jebusites, a Canaanite tribe, for protection in the mountains of Judea. It was situated on the winter trade route, which passed north-south along the watershed between the Jordan Valley and streams that flowed down toward the Mediterranean. The earliest settlement was built at the southern end of a steep-sided ridge, bounded by the Kidron on the east and another small stream on the west. A defensive wall north of the settlement and across the ridge was the only artificial defense line needed. Although the town stood on the hill road from north to south, there was no geographical reason that it should have developed into a major city. It did not have a major water supply, a great river, or a great trade route. Sometimes it was called Jebus, or Jebus, and sometimes Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, which means founded by Salem. Salem was a Canaanite god, either of dawn or of twilight, and the reference might be to the beauty of the place in early morning or in evening light. By the time of Abraham, it was ruled by a king, Melech, who was understood to be the representative on earth of El Elyon, or the Most High God. The Melchizedek of the time of Abraham's rescue of Lot from his captors came out to meet Abraham to offer him hospitality. If Moriah is the area immediately north of the city, then Abraham went back to Jerusalem to obey God's command to sacrifice Isaac. At the time the Jews entered Canaan at the conquest, probably about 500 years later, the ruler of Jerusalem was still regarded as a priest king and was then called Adonai Zedek. All right, David's capital. Jerusalem would probably never have developed in importance had it not been goodness gracious. All right. Rewind, back up, just erase that. All right, Jerusalem would probably never have developed in importance had it not been that the Israelite tribes split into 2 groups at the time of the occupation of Canaan. The tribes that settled in the south had their center in Hebron and came to be strongly pro-David. The tribes that settled in the north came to be strongly pro-Saul. When Saul's remaining son, Ishbosheth, had been murdered, the tribes in the north asked David to be their leader. It was not in the interest of national unity to choose a capital in either north or south or to select a capital already associated with one of the tribes. Jebus, Jerusalem, was a logical choice. It was placed between the northern and southern grouping of tribes, and it was associated with neither group. The king of Jerusalem had been defeated in battle, and though the place had been held for a time by the tribe of Judah, it had regained its independence as a Canaanite city. David, therefore, set out to conquer it and to make it his capital. He accomplished the capture in 2 spectacular ways, by defying a curse and by overcoming a seemingly impassable natural barrier. The Jebusites had brought out their blind and lame as part of a ritual display to curse David's troops with blindness and lameness if they attacked the city. Also, the Jebusites had removed the wooden steps in the shaft leading from the inside of the city to the water supply below. These actions did not deter David and his forces. Led apparently by Joab, they pursued the attack through the narrow water shaft and show their fearlessness of the curse by actually dispatching the blind and the lame. David then built up Jerusalem, expanding its area by means of retaining walls and narrow terraces, which today we know as the Millo. It may have been at this time that the Jews reinterpreted the name of the city so that it became known as the City of Peace, or Yerushalayim, an understanding that has remained ever since. Jesus referred to this name when, knowing the conflicts that were to overtake the city, he said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace." It was not enough, however, to use a neutral city as a capital. It was necessary to develop Jerusalem as a religious center. David achieved this by bringing the Ark of the Covenant to the city, making plans to build a temple to contain it. North of the city was a threshing floor where the angel of God had stopped a plague from going any further. It was the place believed by the Jews to be the spot where Abraham had so nearly sacrificed Isaac. It seemed to be the ideal spot for a temple. David was to leave this development to his son Solomon, but he does seem to have expanded the city northwards up to what was to be the temple site. This involved taking the fortified tower or royal fortress known as the Ophel. So here, this cross section through the Gihon Spring in Jerusalem, that's what they're talking that David's men went through. They removed the wooden steps out of it to make it to where they couldn't climb up it, but that didn't stop them. They still went up through it and captured the city. And then down below, an artist's impression of the city of Jerusalem in the time of David. All righty. And then we have here, on page 186, a portion of wall dating to the time of David's citadel in Jerusalem, and then an outline here, or a map, if you will, Jerusalem in the time of David and Solomon. So this is supposedly where Mount Moriah is here, where the temple is, but this is the original site of the city of David, all right, or Jebus, as he calls it in the previous pages. Right here's the Kidron Valley, which is where the Kidron River runs. And then they expanded north, David did, expanded the city north to where that threshing floor was, or Mount Moriah, and that's where the temple was going to be built. And then that area was, you see this expansion of the city's walls, or Jerusalem, was under the reign of King Solomon. All right, Solomon's temple, or we'll look at this text box on 186. Water for King David. David longed for water from the well of Bethlehem, and 3 of his men fought their way to the well to get it. Instead of drinking the water, David poured it out to the Lord. This story is often not understood. It is based on 2 things. First, it is sometimes possible to give a person something so expensive that he says, "I'm sorry, I really cannot accept it." David felt that way about the risks his men had taken and the blood that had possibly been spilled. The water was too precious for him to accept. Second, a person's most precious things were offered to God. David was giving to God the most precious thing he had. Now, what was the significance of the water from the well at Bethlehem? What did it say earlier in the textbook?
Water.
It was cool water. You know, like that water that's blessed by the Alaskan Eskimo and the water boy, Bobby Boucher's special water that he's got. Solomon's Temple, page 187. When Solomon began to build the temple, he found it was not an easy thing to build on so steep a ridge. David had achieved construction at the southern end by erecting a series of walls and terraces, but Solomon needed to do much more than that. Solomon solved the problem by creating large terraces. These terraces were supported by arches beneath, which were themselves anchored to the hillside, and by massive retaining walls at the edges. The terraces descended from the highest point southward toward Ophel and the main city. The temple was erected on the highest point, and administrative and rural buildings were built on the lower terraces. During the building operations, large numbers of workmen were employed, and large amounts of building material were required. As a result, there was commercial development. The country itself was divided into 12 districts, each district responsible for the upkeep of the royal court for 1 month of the year, for the provision of workmen for the buildings, and for taxes. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Hebron were not taxed, presumably because of the historical links with David's family. The high level of taxation, the exemptions, and the old history of division between north and south led to a permanent division of the kingdom. Eventually, where you see the kingdom kind of splits. The northern tribes, they essentially are still known as Israel, and the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, they become well known as Judah or Judea. The influx of workers and traders probably led to settlements growing on the large flat hill to the west of the city. Now, another thing you have to keep in mind, at the height of Solomon's reign, Israel is probably one of the most wealthiest nations ever in history. Okay, they've went and kind of tallied up the wealth that Solomon would have had. Today's money, it's in the trillions. Okay, and it is just amazing how much wealth they had. But at the same time, the people were highly taxed because the upkeep of the kingdom was very high. You got to remember, the dude had hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines. He had a lot of women that he had to take care of. He was letting them build their own temples for their own gods to worship their own gods. The city, the nation, to keep up with all that, they had to have been highly taxed. And that's what eventually led to the division of the kingdoms. They rebelled because of that. All right, Hezekiah's poor. Because of the division of the kingdom, we would have expected the city to have declined in importance after the reign of Solomon. 10 tribes declared their independence and set up a capital city, first at Shechem and eventually at Samaria. Jerusalem remained the capital for the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, but it still retained great importance because of the temple buildings. Despite the rival shrines set up in the northern kingdom of Israel at Dan and at Bethel. During this period, when there was civil war between Israel and Judah, and when there was deportation to Assyria and Babylon of the most skilled of the population of Israel and Judah, respectively, there were 2 remarkable building developments in Jerusalem. One was undertaken to secure the city's water supplies, which at the time were outside the city's walls, at the pool of Gihon. King Hezekiah bored through the ridge under the city to cause the water to flow through to a new pool built inside the city walls. Then he appears to have blocked off access to the spring from outside the city walls. The other building development during this period was to enclose by a defensive wall the hill to the west of the city where there had been large-scale settlement. That project had the effect of more than doubling the size of the city of Jerusalem. It is difficult to be certain either of the exact line of the wall or of the builder. We do know that after the city had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and Nehemiah was sent from Persia to rebuild the city walls, the line of the wall he repaired included the deep valley to the west of the city of David and the hills on the other side. And down below we have an artist's impression of the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls under Nehemiah. Some good preaching from that portion of the Bible. He's rebuilding the walls. The enemies, they want Nehemiah to come down from the walls, to go down to the valley of Ono. And he wouldn't do it because he was doing a good work. All right. More than I thought. All right. A lot of pictures, though. All right. Jerusalem rebuilt. Jerusalem would have remained a heap of ruin after the Babylonian destruction had it not been that the Persian ruler Cyrus, who had brought the Babylonian Empire to an end, wanted to restore the religious life of the subject peoples. A contingent was therefore allowed to return to Jerusalem under a man called Zerubbabel to restore the temple. That was the spiritual restoration there in Jerusalem. Ezra came to restore the people's knowledge of the law and religious practice, and Nehemiah, through personal contact with the Persian emperor, was allowed to rebuild the walls as the governor of the city. All right, so we see Jerusalem rebuilt in 3 stages. Okay, this is going to be on your study guide, also on the test. All right, the first, all right, we see Zerubbabel go back and rebuild the temple or restore the temple. Then Ezra, he came back. Now at this point, there's people living in Jerusalem, and he returns to restore the people's knowledge of the law and the religious practices thereof. And then Nehemiah, he came back and he was responsible for rebuilding the walls. Okay. This photograph we have on page 190 is probably one of the best depictions we have of Jerusalem. All right, and it is an actual photograph. And, you know, since this time, especially when Israel was reconstituted as a nation, there's been major development in these areas. It doesn't look like this anymore. This is as it looked in Bible times, essentially. And that's what it says, the view of the Jerusalem and the surrounding Judean hills. The landscape had changed little since Bible times at the time of this photo. And what do you recognize? You see all these different levels. Okay, that's where they built up. They had those are when you hear the word terrace, that's what those are, the terraces, the different levels. And they did that to add height, to add more room. That was the main reason, was to add more room, to expand the area on which they could build upon. And they had to do that for the temple and the expansion to the north because, well, the temple was a large building and they had a bunch of other things that they had planned to build. All right. Jerusalem, no, I think I skipped it. Yeah, the last paragraph there. The walls were rebuilt with the labor of the local people and against great discouragement and opposition from outside. The temple was repaired and people once again lived in the city, but the royal buildings and porches were left in ruins so that the temple in effect was an isolated building in the middle of a very large courtyard. Jerusalem thus became the spiritual center of a small Persian province on the fringes of the empire. To the west, or that would have been to the west, or maybe to the northwest. But where Jerusalem was, they were on the fringes of the Persian Empire. So they were far away from the capital, far away from help. So they needed walls. And that's where we see Nehemiah allowed to go back under permission, with permission of the Persian emperor, to go back and to rebuild the walls. All right, 190, Jerusalem under the Seleucids. I've always pronounced it Seleucids. As Babylonian had come to the end as a great power in 538 BC, so in 332 the Persian Empire came to an end, falling to the Greeks under Alexander the Great. This did not have a great political effect on the Jews at Jerusalem, but it had a profound religious effect. Allegiance was switched from Persia to Greece, and Greek ideas and philosophy came to influence many of the religious ideas of the Jews. A Hellenistic party developed that denied bodily resurrection, for example. We've already talked about that. But the more formidable problems in political life for the Jews came later, after Alexander died and the empire was divided up among his generals. Egypt came under the control of Ptolemy, Syria came under the control of Seleucus, and Jerusalem was caught between the two. So, stuck between a rock and a hard place. And that the reason there was so much turmoil after Alexander died was his dying words was pretty much, the empire will pass on to my strongest general. So, of course, that's going to start a fight. Who's the strongest? They didn't agree. They all thought they were the strongest. But if your plan was for the kingdom to prosper, probably chose his last words wrongly. As long as Jerusalem was under control of Ptolemy, the problem was moot, except the large number of Jews were exiled to Alexandria and became the most important Jewish community outside of Jerusalem. Alexandria is where we see a lot of even early Christianity before the Muslims expand that way and pretty much, wipe out any sign of Christianity in the area. That was a very large stronghold for Christianity in that area. Of course, Alexandria, the famed Library of Alexandria, and all of that area was just a big point for both the Jews and also the Christians at a later time. In 198 BC, Jerusalem came finally under the control of the Seleucid king Antiochus. One of his successors, Antiochus Epiphanes, decided that the time had come for all Jews to convert to the Greek religion. He plundered and desecrated the temple, built a fortress on the now deserted hill to the west called the Acra, and systematically sought to destroy the Jewish faith. All right, now do y'all know what he did when it says he desecrated the temple? Do y'all know what he did there? Okay, so what is one animal that the Jews are not to eat? It's a big no-no.
Peas.
Pigs, pork. What he did is he went there and he slaughtered a pig in the temple.
Goodness.
Yeah, so big desecration. Jewish reaction led to a revolt under the Maccabees, a name taken from the nickname. Maccabeus means the hammer, and it was the nickname of one of the resistance leaders. It took many years of conflict and the death of all the rebel leadership before the Acra was defeated and the office of priest and ruler was combined in the family succession. They had to pretty much run Antiochus Epiphanes out of Jerusalem. I could be mistaken, but I believe it was him that, he fled on a chariot and was never seen again in the area. I could be wrong on that, but I feel like I remember hearing that in church history, I think, with Brother Joe. All right, the Hasmoneans or Hasmoneans rebuild. The new rulers, known as the Hasmoneans, because they retained the family name of Hashmon, were able to expand the size of their territory until they occupied the area once held by Judah and Israel. The city of Jerusalem became prosperous through trade. A new element affected its prosperity. There were now so many Jews scattered throughout the Middle East that when they came to the temple to take part in the pilgrim feasts, they brought much of their wealth and goods with them. In rebuilding the city, the Hasmoneans again enclosed the western hill, and they dug a deep fosse 60 feet deep and 250 feet across beyond the northern wall of the temple. They built their own palace opposite the Ophel over what had become known as the Tyropoeon Valley. It is in the south-facing northern side of the fosse that the Garden Tomb is to be found today. It is revered by Christians as a place similar, as a place similar to that in which Jesus was buried and from which he rose from the dead. All right, Herodian Jerusalem. The history of Jerusalem between the establishment of the Hasmonean priest kings and the time of Jesus is particularly tragic. The Hasmoneans quarreled among themselves, and in seeking power allied themselves to alien forces, so that Jerusalem was subject to Roman, Parthian, and Herodian invasion. During the period the Roman armies were in the area, Antipater, king of the Edomites, entered into an alliance with the Romans to support a contender to the Jewish throne and thereby made himself effective ruler of the area under the Romans. Antipater was driven out by the Parthians, who supported another contender, and Jerusalem at last fell to his son Herod, who was granted legions from Rome to retake the city. So Herod the Great became king of the Jews. That's why he was so threatened by Jesus. All right. Herod had a perennial problem of insecurity because he was hated by the Jews. One resolution of that problem was through bribery. So as to ingratiate himself with the Jews, he decided to rebuild the temple. And oh, did he rebuild the temple. He cleared the entire site of Solomon's temple and royal palaces, extending the work south so as to produce a platform 400 yards long and 300 yards wide. So that's 1,200 feet long and 900 feet wide. On this, he built a temple twice as high as was Solomon's. The courtyard was surrounded by magnificent colonnades, and the whole palace was one of the building wonders of ancient times. This was the temple that featured so often in the life of Jesus. Herod's other approach was to build fortified palaces. Masada and Herodion were built in the country, and Jerusalem itself was fortified by two great castles. One of these, Castle Antonia, named in honor of Mark Antony, was built at the northwest corner of the new temple and overlooked it. It was in this place that Jesus appeared before Pilate, and where steps led down into the temple and provided a convenient rostrum for Paul to speak to the temple crowds. Page 196. A further fortified palace was built on the western wall on the edge of the western hill. It was built around 3 towers. It was there that Herod received Jesus on the morning of the crucifixion. Finally, Herod built a large wall from Castle Antonia to his own citadel, the wall arching over the northwestern area beyond the existing city. The wall enclosed settlements, markets, the pool of Bethesda, and domestic dwellings. It had to come back at an angle to avoid an ancient quarry now made into a garden. The quarry, with a spur out to the center, which the quarrymen had left, became the public place for crucifixion. In the quarry wall was a tomb that was as yet unused. It was to become the site for the crucifixion of Jesus. At a later point in history, another wall was built to bring in other domestic dwellings north of the city. It linked the citadel to Antonia again, but there is still a great deal of argument as to whether it included Herod's northern wall or whether that was even farther to the northwest. Okay, this is important, this next sentence here. Okay, this will be on the test. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman general Titus in AD 70. That'll probably, and then continuing after a rebellion led by the Zealots. Okay, that will be on the test, probably in the form of 2 questions. All right, Jerusalem was destroyed by which empire and under which general? Okay, so that'll probably be combined into 2 questions, probably a short answer question, and then Jerusalem was destroyed in AD blank, and that'll probably be a fill in the blank question. After yet another revolt in AD 135, the Emperor Hadrian plowed up the land south of the temple and rebuilt a new city to the north, which he called Aelia Capitolina. Effectively, Jerusalem had moved north, with the temple now at the southeast corner, the position it holds today. Now, back on the previous page illustration, we're looking, I always found this picture confusing, but you have to think, here we're looking to the south in this picture, okay? You see that's the Kidron River there, all right? And that's going south, okay? So that's what direction we're looking there. Because I was confused quite a few times when looking at this picture, but it really does it is a really good illustration. artist's impression of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Okay, so there you've got the Hinnom Valley. All rubbish from the whole of Jerusalem was dumped and burnt here. That's that valley down there. Let me look at something real quick. I may have misspoke. Okay, no, that's right. Okay, that is the Kidron Valley, Kidron River there. I was just making sure. Okay, and we'll just work from the bottom or top left around clockwise. There, you got a picture where the possible site for the upper room is. And then you have the palace of Caiaphas and Annas, the high priests. It doesn't look very palacey. Maybe they put the arrow to the wrong building. All right, there at the very bottom, I would have felt like their area would have been closer to the temple. There you've got the Sanhedrin all the way down where the temple is. That's where the Sanhedrin met. All right, Herod's temple, of course, kind of easy to point out there. Then you have the Antonia fortress. The fort was situated northwest of the temple area. In Jesus' time, a battalion of Roman soldiers was stationed there. So that Castle Antonia that we've been seeing in our textbook, that's that building right there. All right, then you have Herod's palace to the west, or to the top part of the picture. And you have Golgotha, the place of the skull, probably the site of Jesus' crucifixion. And it actually looks like they have some going on there in the illustration. Then you have the pool of Bethesda. Here Jesus healed a man who had been a cripple for 38 years. Then you've got the Golden Gate, the gate into the temple area. And you have the Hippodrome. Anybody know what occurred at the Hippodrome?
Gladiator fights.
Huh?
I said gladiator fights.
I don't know about gladiator. Could have been, but that's where you would have horse races, chariot races.
Mm.
And then the amphitheater, which is kind of in the name. Anybody want to take a guess on what happened there?
It's a theater.
Theater. They had plays and reenactments and stuff like that. Now this area here is the original city of David. So that's you, and you look from that area. All right, then it expanded this way at one point under King David and Solomon. And then, it, of course, it expanded to the north a little bit where the temple was. And then you see expansion to the west, and all of these kind of look the same. And then you get over here and you see the different roofs. That's a lot of the Roman expansion and the expansion under the Greeks and the Seleucids and the Romans, of course. All right, forgot one there. Gethsemane. This name means oil press. May have been an orchard of olive trees surrounded by a wall. Here Jesus prayed before Judas Iscariot came with Jewish soldiers to arrest him. All right. Yeah, the far left here. This is a model of Jerusalem in Jesus' time, showing the Roman castle Antonia overlooking the temple. Then right beside the caption there, artist's impression of the trial of Jesus outside the castle Antonia, in Jerusalem. Note the whipping post and the judge's seat or the bema seat.
I got a question. So is the Mount of Olives same as Moriah? Are they the same place?
I don't think so. I don't think so. We'll definitely learn that in geography, but I don't think so. Okay, but we are done. Next week we'll test on chapter 10. I'm going to go and I've got a study guide for chapter 11. I just need to update it because there are probably some things I'll take out of it, some things I may add to it. But we'll test on that on this chapter in 2 weeks. And then next week when we go over chapter 12, we'll be testing on that one. And I did look on that calendar, all the calendars. For some reason, I got in my head that we might have had one less week of school, but the 18th is the day of finals. 18th and 19th on the calendar, though it will probably just end up all being on the 18th. So we'll review for that the week before. And on the 18th of December is the day your research papers are due on your artifact. So, all right. Any questions or comments? Then we'll close with a word of prayer. Would any of y'all like to, either of you like to lead us?
Oh.
Good.
Well, we come to you today. Just thankful for the chance to be here, Lord, learn about you. Lord, we ask that you be with any prayer requests that have been mentioned or any unspoken ones, Lord. Be with Brother BJ's wife. Be with the doctors that are tending to her, Lord. Just guide their hands, Lord. We ask that you be with us for the rest of the day, and ask that you help us just soak up everything that we're learning. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.